Dr. Stephen Mitchell had spent 22 years at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. He'd worked on Mars rovers, deep space probes, and orbital mechanics, calculations that put spacecraft exactly where they needed to be, millions of miles from Earth. As lead mission engineer for the upcoming Mars sample return mission, the most complex robotic mission NASA had ever attempted, Dr. Mitchell ran his team with exacting standards. Every calculation had to be perfect. Every trajectory had to be precise. There was no room for error when you're navigating spacecraft across interplanetary distances, where a tiny mistake could doom years of work and billions of dollars in investment. The newest member of his engineering team was Carlos Reyes, who'd joined JPL 6 months earlier after completing his aerospace engineering PhD at MIT. Carlos had strong credentials. His doctoral research on orbital mechanics had been published in peer-reviewed journals, and his thesis advisor had recommended him highly. But Dr. Mitchell had worked with dozens of newly minted PhDs over the years, and he knew the difference between academic knowledge and the practical experience needed for real mission-critical work. When Carlos offered input during planning meetings, Dr. Mitchell would acknowledge it politely, but defer to the senior engineers who'd actually flown missions before. "That's an interesting academic perspective, Carlos, but let me tell you how we actually do this in operational What bothered Carlos most wasn't being new. He expected to learn from experienced engineers. What bothered him was that Dr. Mitchell seemed to dismiss his contributions more readily than those of other junior engineers, and Carlos suspected it had something to do with being Filipino. When a junior engineer from MIT, who joined the same time as Carlos, suggested a trajectory optimization, Dr. Mitchell engaged seriously with the idea. When Carlos suggested a similar approach for a different maneuver, Dr. Mitchell said, "Let's stick with proven methods rather than experimental approaches. We can't afford creativity when mission success is at stake." It was subtle, but the pattern was clear. Dr. Mitchell treated Carlos as less capable, less trustworthy with critical work. The Mars sample return mission had 3 phases. A lander would collect Martian soil samples, launch them into Mars orbit in a small Ascent vehicle, and a separate orbiter would rendezvous with the sample container, capture it, and return it to Earth. The orbital rendezvous was the most technically challenging part of Ascent. Vehicle and orbiter had to meet in Mars orbit with such precision that the orbiter could capture the basketball-sized sample container, traveling at thousands of miles per hour. The rendezvous required calculations accounting for Mars's gravity, atmospheric drag on the Ascent vehicle, orbital perturbations, and timing precise to within seconds across a sequence lasting several days. Dr. Mitchell had led the trajectory planning team that calculated the rendezvous parameters. They'd spent 18 months modeling every variable, running thousands of simulations, and verifying the math through multiple independent checks. The plan was locked in and uploaded to the spacecraft. The lander had successfully reached Mars, collected samples, and was preparing for Ascent launch. The orbiter was already in Mars orbit, waiting. Mission control at JPL was staffed 24/7 as they approached the critical rendezvous sequence. Everyone knew this was the moment that would determine whether years of work succeeded or failed. Carlos had been assigned to the monitoring team, not making decisions, just watching telemetry data and flagging any anomalies for senior engineers to evaluate. It was appropriate work for a junior engineer on his first mission, but Carlos had spent the previous months studying the rendezvous plan in detail. Not because he was assigned to, but because he wanted to understand it deeply. He'd run his own simulations, checked the trajectory calculations, and verified the orbital mechanics. The plan was solid, but 3 days before the scheduled Ascent launch, as Carlos reviewed the latest Mars atmospheric data transmitted from the lander, he noticed something that made him pause. Mars's atmosphere is thin and variable. The mission plan accounted for expected atmospheric density based on seasonal models and historical data. But the latest readings from the lander showed atmospheric density at the launch site was significantly higher than the models had predicted. A dust storm system had moved through the region, stirring up atmospheric particles. Carlos ran quick calculations. Higher atmospheric density meant more drag on the Ascent vehicle during its climb to orbit. More drag meant the vehicle would reach orbit with slightly less velocity than planned. Less velocity meant it would arrive at the rendezvous point slightly later than expected, maybe only seconds, but when you're trying to capture a container moving at orbital speed, seconds meant kilometers of position error. Carlos brought his analysis to Dr. Mitchell during the daily mission briefing. Dr. Mitchell, I've been reviewing the atmospheric data from the landing site. Density is running about 18% higher than our model predicted due to the recent dust activity. I think this could affect the Ascent vehicle's velocity profile, enough to impact rendezvous timing. We might need to adjust the orbiter's capture sequence timing to compensate. Dr. Mitchell looked at the data briefly. Carlos, the mission plan accounts for atmospheric variability. We built in margins for exactly these kinds of deviations. The Ascent vehicle has thrust reserve to compensate for drag variations. This is why we spend 18 months planning so we don't have to make last-minute changes based on minor atmospheric fluctuations. Carlos persisted. Sir, I understand we have margins, but I ran the numbers with the current atmospheric density, and the velocity reduction might exceed our margin assumptions. The Ascent vehicle will compensate with thrust, yes, but there's a limit to how much delta V reserve it has. If we're at the edge of our margin envelope and we don't adjust the orbiter's timing, we risk the sample container arriving at the rendezvous point when the orbiter isn't positioned correctly to capture it. Dr. Mitchell's patience was wearing thin. Carlos, I appreciate your diligence, but this is exactly the kind of over-analysis that junior engineers tend to do. You're looking at one data point and extrapolating a mission-critical problem. We have a team of senior trajectory engineers who've reviewed this plan exhaustively. We're not going to redesign the rendezvous sequence 3 days before execution based on atmospheric readings that are within the variability we planned for. Other engineers in the room shifted uncomfortably. Carlos's analysis wasn't obviously wrong, but Dr. Mitchell was the lead engineer, and the mission plan had been vetted thoroughly. Changing it now would require recalculating orbital parameters, uploading new command sequences to the spacecraft, and getting approval from mission management. Huge undertaking with significant risk of introducing errors. The safe choice was to trust the existing plan. Carlos tried once more. Dr. Mitchell, I know it seems like I'm being overcautious, but the math suggests this is outside our margin. Can we at least run updated simulations with the current atmospheric data to verify we're still within parameters? Dr. Mitchell ended the discussion. Carlos, your job is to monitor telemetry, not to redesign mission plans. We have the situation under control. Focus on your assigned responsibilities. Carlos returned to his monitoring station, frustrated but uncertain. Was he wrong? Was he overreacting to normal variability? Or was Dr. Mitchell dismissing legitimate analysis because he didn't trust a junior Filipino engineer's calculations enough to take them seriously? Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that if a senior engineer had raised the same concern, Dr. Mitchell would have at least run the verification simulations. Launch day for the Ascent vehicle arrived. The entire sequence was automated. The lander's ascent stage would ignite, climb through Mars's thin atmosphere, and insert the sample container into the planned orbit, where the orbiter would be waiting to capture it. Mission control watched as telemetry showed the ascent stage igniting perfectly. The vehicle climbed through the atmosphere, right on trajectory. But as it reached the upper atmosphere, where drag effects were diminishing, Carlos watched the velocity readings and felt his stomach tighten. The vehicle was running slower than predicted, not by much, maybe 40 meters per second below the planned velocity profile at that altitude. That matched exactly what his calculations had suggested atmospheric drag would do. The Ascent vehicle continued burning, compensating with its thrust reserve exactly as designed. It reached orbit and released the sample container. The container was now in Mars orbit, coasting toward the rendezvous point where it would meet the orbiter. Mission control erupted in applause. The most difficult launch sequence in Mars mission history had succeeded. But Carlos was running calculations furiously at his monitoring station. The velocity deficit from atmospheric drag meant the container had entered orbit with slightly less energy than planned. It was following a slightly lower, slower trajectory. It would reach the rendezvous coordinates about 8 seconds later than the mission plan expected. 8 seconds didn't sound like much, but at orbital velocities, the sample container was traveling at about 3.4 kilometers per second relative to Mars. 8 seconds meant the container would be approximately 27 kilometers away from where the orbiter expected it to be. The orbiter's capture mechanism had a range of only a few hundred meters. If the container arrived at 27 kilometers off position, the orbiter would miss it entirely. The sample container would sail past into a Mars orbit where it couldn't be recovered, and the entire mission would fail despite the perfect launch. Carlos checked his math 3 times. Then he stood up and walked directly to Dr. Mitchell's station. Dr. Mitchell, the sample container is off trajectory. The atmospheric drag was higher than our model predicted. exactly as the data suggested 3 days ago. The container entered orbit with a velocity deficit, and it's going to arrive at the rendezvous 0.8 seconds late, which means it'll be 27 kilometers from where the orbiter expects it. We need to update the orbiter's capture sequence now, or we're going to miss the rendezvous entirely. The mission control room suddenly went quiet. Other engineers pulled up the trajectory data Carlos was referencing. Dr. Mitchell stared at his screens, comparing the actual orbital parameters of the sample container with the predicted values. Carlos was right. The container was following a trajectory measurably different from the flight plan. Dr. Mitchell's face went pale as he ran quick calculations, confirming what Carlos had said. If they did nothing, the orbiter would execute its capture sequence at the planned time. But the sample container wouldn't be there, which arrived 8 seconds later, long after the orbiter's brief capture window had passed. They had maybe 90 minutes before the orbiter reached the rendezvous point and executed its programmed sequence. They needed to recalculate the orbiter's timing, generate new command sequences, upload them to the spacecraft, and execute the revised capture maneuver all within 90 minutes. And they needed to get it right on the first try, because there wouldn't be time for a second attempt. Dr. Mitchell immediately activated emergency protocols, calling in the senior trajectory team, but he also turned to Carlos. Carlos, you predicted this 3 days ago. You have the updated atmospheric data already integrated into your calculations. I need you to lead the trajectory recalculation. Use whatever resources you need, but I need new rendezvous parameters in 45 minutes, so we have time to verify and upload them. Carlos nodded and got to work. He pulled together a team, including 2 senior orbital mechanics engineers, and they began recalculating the rendezvous, using the actual observed trajectory of the sample container, rather than the predicted one. The math was complex. They needed to determine exactly when and where the sample container would reach the rendezvous zone, given its actual orbital parameters. Then calculate precisely when the orbiter needed to execute its capture sequence to be in position at that moment. They had to account for Mars's gravitational variations, orbital perturbations, the orbiter's current position and velocity, and the timing constraints of the spacecraft's command execution systems. Carlos worked with intense focus, cross-checking every calculation, while the senior engineers verified his math in parallel. 43 minutes later, Carlos delivered the updated parameters to Dr. Mitchell. The numbers showed the orbiter needed to delay its capture sequence by exactly 8.3 seconds and adjust its position slightly to account for where the sample container would actually be. The trajectory team verified Carlos's calculations. They were correct. The new command sequence was uploaded to the orbiter with 30 minutes to spare before the original rendezvous time. Mission Control watched tensely as the orbiter executed the revised sequence. The spacecraft adjusted its position, waited the additional 8.3 seconds, and deployed its capture mechanism exactly as the sample container arrived at the rendezvous point. Telemetry confirmed capture success. The orbiter had the sample container secured. The mission control room exploded in cheers and applause. Years of work, billions of dollars, humanity's first Mars sample returnal saved because one junior engineer had caught a trajectory error that everyone else had dismissed. After the initial celebration subsided, Dr. Mitchell stood and addressed the mission control team. I need to say something. 3 days ago, Carlos Reyes brought me analysis showing that atmospheric conditions at the Mars landing site would affect our rendezvous trajectory. He was exactly right. I dismissed his analysis because I assumed our existing mission plan, vetted by senior engineers over 18 months, couldn't be wrong. I told him he was overanalyzing and should focus on his assigned responsibilities. If Carlos hadn't persisted, if he hadn't been watching the trajectory data during Ascent, if he hadn't had the courage to come to me during the emergency and say I told you this would happen, we would have lost this mission. The sample container would have missed rendezvous and been unrecoverable. Dr. Mitchell looked at Carlos. I was wrong. I dismissed your analysis not because it was flawed, but because I didn't trust that a junior engineer, especially one I'd mentally categorized as less experienced, could see something our senior team had missed. But you did see it. You did the math correctly. You tried to warn us, and when the crisis happened, you were the only person in this room who already understood the problem and knew how to solve it, because you'd been running these calculations for 3 days. The room was silent. Dr. Mitchell continued, Carlos, you saved this mission, not through luck, but through solid engineering, careful analysis, and the courage to speak up even when the lead engineer told you to stay in your lane. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you 3 days ago. and I'm grateful you are watching today. In the weeks following the successful sample return, Dr. Mitchell requested that Carlos be promoted from junior monitoring role to the trajectory analysis team. He also implemented new protocols requiring that any engineers concerned about mission-critical parameters receive mandatory simulation verification regardless of the engineer's seniority level. "We almost lost a multi-billion-dollar mission," Dr. Mitchell told JPL leadership, "because I created an environment where a junior engineer's valid analysis could be dismissed without serious consideration. That can't happen again. Every engineer at JPL, regardless of their background or seniority, deserves to have their technical work evaluated on its merits." Carlos continued working at JPL, eventually becoming a lead trajectory engineer himself on subsequent Mars missions. But he never forgot being dismissed by Dr. Mitchell, not because it bothered him personally, but because it taught him how dangerous it is when technical organizations create cultures where certain people's expertise is automatically discounted. Years later, when Carlos led his own teams, he made a point of seriously evaluating technical input from junior engineers, from engineers who didn't fit the traditional NASA profile, from anyone who brought solid analysis, regardless of whether it challenged existing plans. Dr. Mitchell kept a photo in his office from the mission control celebration after the successful sample capture. Carlos is in the center, surrounded by engineers congratulating him. Under the photo, Dr. Mitchell wrote a note that he showed to every new engineer who joined his team. "The junior engineer I called junior engineer, like it was a limitation, saved the most important mission of my career. He saw what I missed, warned me when I wouldn't listen, and solved the problem when I finally understood he'd been right all along." Good engineering isn't about seniority or credentials. It's about doing the math correctly, trusting your analysis, and speaking up even when senior people tell you you're wrong. Carlos Reyes taught me that lesson, and it made me a better engineer. The NASA engineer who dismissed Carlos as just a junior engineer learned that some of the best aerospace engineering doesn't come from decades of experience or prestigious positions. It comes from rigorous analysis, attention to data, and the courage to challenge existing plans when the math says something's wrong. And a Filipino engineer who'd been told to stay in his lane proved that lane discipline matters less than getting the trajectory right, especially when you're trying to capture a basketball-sized container traveling at thousands of miles per hour in orbit around Mars.